Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome on behalf of the Indo-German Chamber of Commerce and our partners for today, SW India, member firm of SW International. Union Budget 2022. Experts have been analyzing and decoding the budget in the last few days since it has been announced. Progressive and people-friendly, with India expected to grow at 9.27% in the coming year. So, ladies and gentlemen, on our members' demand, we at IGCC, Indo-German Chamber of Commerce, are holding our second session this week already on the Union Budget. So, very briefly on our partners for today afternoon. SW India is a member firm of SW International and is present in 10 cities across India. It has a strong leadership of 16 practice leaders with 300 plus professional staff base. It is engaged in providing services in the field of assurance and audit, direct and international tax, including transfer pricing, indirect tax, estate planning and family business succession, risk advisory and corporate finance. And for this budget webinar, we are also pleased to introduce our speakers today, Mr. Atul Puri, Senior Practice Leader, Tax and Assurance. Atul, welcome to today's session. Mr. Saurav Sood, Practice Leader, International Tax and Transfer Pricing. Welcome, Saurav. And Mr. Ankur Gupta, Practice Leader, Indirect Tax, who will be taking us through the key proposals from direct and tax and indirect tax perspectives. We are very much looking forward to hearing your analysis and, of course, the implications on income tax and custom provisions. Followed by the session, of course, we will have question and answer sessions and, of course, the closing remarks. My name is Sonia Prasher. I'm the Deputy Director General at the Chamber. Very quickly on the Chamber, 66 years, promoting Indo-German partnership with offices in head office in Mumbai, office in Delhi, Bangalore, Chennai, Kolkata, Pune, and a liaison office in Düsseldorf. My only statement is that yes, we are here for our members, and that is what we do best, connecting partnerships and fostering relationships, business relationships. And this session today is also for the sake of our members, and thank you SW India for joining us today afternoon. So over to Atul to take it forward, and ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the session today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and a very good afternoon to all the participants, the delegates for today's session on the Finance Budget 2022. We are going to discuss and deliberate the economic survey provisions which have been laid down for proposal under the direct tax as well as indirect tax. And of course, there are many questions and answers which are yet to be addressed as an implication to a specific industry or a specific individual, which we will try to address them at the end of the session. So our primary focus will be with respect to the economic survey, direct tax and indirect tax. Next slide, please.
I'll just suggest, is my screen visible now?
Yes.
Saurav, can you just put the presentation on presentation mode, please?
PPT mode.
I've opened up the PDF version. You want me to open the presentation? Just give me 1 second. Yeah, just give me 1 second. Let me know once it's visible.
Yeah, this is fine. Thank you.
So to start with the economic survey was written under the cloud of COVID in 2021. These have been very difficult times for all of us, including the world economy. It is not just about the immediate disruption, uncertainty caused by the repeated waves of the pandemic, but also the longer term uncertainty about the post-COVID world due to accelerated shifts in technology, consumer behavior, supply chain, geopolitics, climate change, and a host of other factors. Now, amidst all these challenges, if we look at the growth or the growth outlook of India, it looks pretty promising as of now. If we see the trend from effective from 2018, India was probably growing at a real GDP of around 6.5%, then reduced to 4%, and in the pandemic year of 2020, it retracted to 7.25%, which was the year impacting almost all the global economies. In 2021, as per the IMF, it has been pegged at about 9.5%, and the economic survey has pegged the growth of Indian GDP around 8 to 8.5% during the fiscal year 22-23. So this implies that the overall economic activity has recovered past the pre-pandemic levels. Next slide. Yeah, so with respect to the exports, I will just briefly discuss with respect to the key financial indicators over here. With respect to the exports, the India's exports of both goods and services have been exceptionally strong so far in 21-22. The merchandise exports have been above $30 billion for 8 consecutive months in 21-22, despite a rise in trade costs arising from global supply constraints. So there has been a considerable jump in the goods and services exports as compared to the previous 2 fiscal years. Next slide. In comparison, even the imports also recovered strongly with the revival of the domestic demand and continuous rise in the price of imported crude and metals. We see about 30% of increase in the year 21-22 in the imports, surpassing the corresponding pre-pandemic levels. Next slide, Saurabh. A very interesting fact which I wanted to highlight in the economic survey of 2021 was with respect to the patents. So India has been very conservative as compared to the with the Western world as well as China, where if you see about a decade ago, India had registered or applied for about 40,000 patents in the year 2010-11, of which about 7,500 got approvals. However, if you see the current scenario in 2021, there are about 58,500 applications which were filed, of which 28,000 were approved for patent. This comes with a majority of percentage from the Indian residents instead of the multinational companies. So there is a paradigm shift in the innovation which has been evolving around over the last 1 decade, which is very much visible from the number of patents which has been registered. Consequently, India's ranking in global innovation has also jumped 35 ranks from 81st in 2015 to 46th in 2021. So this was a very brief about the economic survey and the key financial indicators. With this, we move on to our first key area for discussion with respect to the direct tax. So majority of the taxpayers, specifically individuals, look forward to the finance budget with respect to the savings they will be able to make post budget. So unfortunately, for our dear friends, we do not have any good news, and their tax burden remains status quo as compared to the previous financial year. Specifically to talk about in case of individuals, partnership firms, LLPs and domestic companies or companies where the tax rate remains status quo and it will be rolled over as it is from the previous financial year 2021. There is some minor tweaking which has been done in the case of cooperative societies, which we will be discussing in the following slides. So to start with, my first proposal, the first proposal for amendment was with respect to the reduction in the surcharge and the alternate minimum tax in case of cooperative societies. So in case of cooperative societies, if we can see that the surcharge was levied at the rate of 12% if the income was in the band of 1 crore to 10 crores. This has been proposed to be reduced from 12% to 7%. And also there is a provision of alternate minimum tax which was levied under section 115 JC, levied at the rate of 18.5%. In order to bring it at par with the corporates, this has been proposed to be reduced to further 15% instead of 18.5%. The surcharge applicable at income exceeding rupees 10 crores remains 12% as in the previous year. So that is one change which has been proposed in case of cooperative societies with respect to the tax rates. Now, our second proposal is with respect to the surcharge in case of long-term capital gains. So this has been a pain point for the individual taxpayers who have been investing in unlisted private limited companies in India. The surcharge applicable in case of individual HUF, Hindu undivided families or AOPs, where their income if exceeds 5 crore rupees was 37%. This was causing a lot of hardship and burden to them as compared to the investment if made through any other legal entity. So in order to bring it at par and to reduce the burden, it has been decided or proposed to reduce the tax from 37% to the surcharge from 37% to 15%. But just to add, this reduction is only applicable in case of unlisted private limited companies. So this will very largely benefit in case of investments made by HNIs or ultra HNIs in the startup ventures, where in case of transfer of shares, if it is beyond a period of 12 months, it will basically reduce the tax burden with respect to the surcharge from 37% to 15%. There was an amendment in the previous year under section 242C, where the definition of slum sale was amended in order to settle the long-lasting legal litigations in case of Smith Securities and other similar cases, where depreciation on transfer of sale or on slum sale was basically not to be considered for the purpose of writing of the depreciation in the acquiring entity. Now, while amending this section, but erroneously in the last paragraph of this section, the word sales was not modified with the word transfer. So they are just making a mechanical change over here, where the word sales is being replaced with transfer, since the intent was always to consider all kind of transfers under the slum sale transaction. So there's just a typographic error which was there, which is being modified. It has got no implication with respect to the impact on the slum sale transactions. The next proposal for amendment is under section 14A, where there has been an amendment where there has been a long-lasting disputes related to the expense which is being claimed by the assessees in accordance with Rule 8D of the Income Tax Act rules. Here, the expense, the litigation has been with respect to the expense not to be charged or not to be claimed in the income tax return if there is no exempted income which is accrued or received during the relevant assessment year. However, there is an explanation which has been added now in order to settle the long-lasting litigations with the tax department, wherein by virtue of this explanation, the section 14A cannot be the amendment cannot be invoked in the absence of the exempted income. So which means that even if there is no income which has been earned during the relevant assessment year, then also the disallowance of expenditure has to be done in accordance with Rule 8D. So even if there is no expenditure, even if there is no income which has been exempted income which has been earned during the assessment year, still the expense has to be disallowed in accordance with Rule 8D of the income tax rules. So this explanation will basically settle the ambiguity with respect to the claiming of the expenditure. Next is the amendment which is with respect to section 37(1), wherein I would reiterate there has been a dispute also in this case, where the disallowance of expenditure on case of prohibited law has been subject to litigation. So in order to and also to add, there has been a CBDT circular, circular number 5/2012, where it was noted that the Indian Medical Council, in exercise of the statutory powers, amended the IMC regulation imposing a prohibition on the medical practitioners and their professional associations from taking any gift, travel facility, hospitality, cash, or monetary grant from the pharmaceutical and allied health sector industries. So it was basically identified that Section 37(1) specifically disallows any expenditure which is prohibited under any law. However, there were several disputes, and this circular was challenged in the Himachal Pradesh High Court in case of Confederation of Indian Pharmaceutical, where ultimately, in order to settle this position, CBDT finally has come out with an explanation and has clarified that in case there is any kind of expense which is prohibited under any law, it cannot be allowed as an expenditure under Section 37 of the Income Tax Act. Yeah, next slide. Sorry. Okay, so with respect to Section 28(4), where the income is earned in kind in the sense where any income which is being earned by way of any kind of beneficial arrangement, which falls under the definition of under the purview of Section 28 subsection 4, it used to escape the tax net earlier because the recipient of this income was never declaring it in its tax return. So in order to plug this loophole, a new withholding tax provision is being introduced through Section 194R, wherein 10% withholding tax is being proposed if the value of such benefit or arrangement or perquisite exceeds 20,000 rupees. So it will be the responsibility of the payer who is basically giving the income to deduct TDS at the rate of 10% in order to ensure that the receiver of the income comes under the ambit of the tax. So it's a new provision which has been added to Section 194 of the Act. Then another long litigation which we have also been facing is with respect to the cess, whether the cess has to be classified as a allowable expenditure under the income tax or not has been the question. There have been certain taxpayers who have been claiming this deduction on account of cess or surcharge under Section 40 as an expense, as a business expense, and not as an income tax, which is otherwise not forming part of the profit from business income. So in this case, the assessees have been, or the companies have been, relying on the judicial precedents of Honorable Bombay High Court in the case of Sisa Goa Limited, as well as in case of Chambal Fertilizers and Chemicals Limited, pronounced by Honorable Rajasthan High Court, where their interpretation was that the education cess can be claimed as an allowable expenditure while computing the income chargeable under the heads of profits and gains of business or profession. However, there was a counter judgment also, which was announced by the Kolkata Tribunal in the case of Kanoria Chemicals and Industries, where it was basically interpreted counter to the previous two judgments, that any cess which is paid is not to be considered as an expense, and it forms part of the income tax only. So there is no question that it can be allowed as an expense. Now this has been inserted as an explanation to Section 48(2) to clarify that the term tax always included surcharge or cess, and this amendment has been introduced retrospectively, effective from 1st April 2005. So any litigations which are already in place will also fall into place due to this retrospective amendment to Section 48(2). Yeah, so there has been a procedural change with respect to the bonus stripping under Section 94 subsection 8, where in case of the existing provisions, only the term units was defined, and it did not include securities. However, in order to widen the scope of Section 94 and in order to cover the securities other than the units, it is also proposed to include securities, units of infrastructure investment trust, or real estate investment trust, or alternate investment funds. So this will basically widen the scope of the Section 94 subsection 8. The next key proposal for amendment is with respect to Section 43B, wherein we have experienced in the past that interest which has been accrued on debentures, lot of assessees tend to convert that interest into the form of a loan or a borrowing, or further convert them into the debenture only, and thereby claim the deduction under section 43B. So 43B, let me add, is specifically applicable in case of liabilities which are payable under a particular statute, like for interest paid to any kind of NBFC, financial institution, public financial institution. So these interest, such kind of interest, when converted into a debenture, was actually escaping the clutches of section 43B, which is a non-abstante section. So in order to curb this issue and to basically cut down on such kind of assessees where they are claiming that they have actually made the payment and claim the exemption or deduction under section 43B, in this case they have basically proposed to restrict the deduction where an interest is converted into debenture and such interest is not paid in actual. So if the interest is not paid in actual, then it cannot be considered as paid under in accordance with section 43B and will be disallowed. This may lead to a permanent disallowance, because interest once converted into the debenture will be paid in the form of the principal only. So that we have to be very careful while converting any kind of interest payable to the financial institutions or NBFCs into the form of a debenture. Okay, so the next critical amendment has been proposed in under section 68, where earlier there was no, if I have to reiterate, under section 68 earlier, the onus was on the recipient of any kind, any funds, where he had to justify the source, genuineness and creditworthiness of the any kind of share capital, share premium or security premium which has been received or credited in these books of accounts. However, there was no onus on the payer. So any person who is providing the entry, there was no onus on him to provide the source of his funds, how he has provided. And this used to escape the clutches of section 68. Now, in order to expand the scope of section 68, it is being proposed through a proviso that even the person who is providing the entry, or who is basically providing the loan or a borrowing to the assessee, he is also required to explain the source of funds, and it is not just limited to the identity and creditworthiness of that particular entry provider. So this will basically curb the practice of conversion of unaccounted money by crediting it to the books of assessees through a series of loans or borrowings. The next new insertion is with respect to section 79A, where undisclosed income, earlier there was no such provision that undisclosed income, if found during a search and seizure operation, was allowed to be set off against the brought forward losses and unabsorbed depreciation. However, now, by virtue of new insertion through section 79A, any income which is found during the search or survey action, and if the assessee tends to set off this against any brought forward losses and unabsorbed depreciation, this section 79A will debar such kind of set off, and the taxes will be paid on the entire amount which has been detected during the search or survey operations. Yeah. The Finance Act 21 introduced us with section 115 BAB with respect to reduced rate of corporate tax for new domestic manufacturing company at the rate of 15%. Here there was a precondition that the assessee company should be able to start production on or before 31st March 2023. In consideration of the COVID pandemic scenario, the government has proposed to increase this time limit by 1 year further to 31st March 2024 from 31st March 2023. So this is just a limitation change with respect to the domestic manufacturing companies who are intending to avail the reduced tax benefit at the rate of 15%. Then a very important update is being made by virtue of insertion of section 139(8)(a), where where an opportunity is being given to file an updated return by and there was no such existing provision in the Income Tax Act where you can actually update a return which has been filed. So in this case, if a assessee has the opportunity basically to file an updated return within 2 years from the end of the assessment year. However, this comes with some condition precedents. It is not that any or every return can be basically updated in this time period or window of 2 years. So the first condition over here is with respect to the return not furnished, may be furnished or updated within the 2 years from the end of the assessment year. Second point is with respect to that subsection 8A will not apply if the updated return tends to basically further reduce the loss. So if supposing the original return filed was a loss return, if by virtue of filing this updated return it further reduces the loss, then it is not permitted to be covered under section 139(8)(a). So 139 subsection 8A allows only enhancement of the tax. There is no provision for reduction in the taxes over here. Also, in case, the third condition is in case there is any search or survey operations which have already been initiated for the relevant assessment year for which the assessee intends to file an updated return, it is blocked and there is no possibility that such updated return can be filed for such assessment year. So there is no opportunity where he can file an updated return. Further, also, once this updated return, the assessee cannot make any changes once the updated return has already been filed. Also, if any kind of proceedings during that relevant assessment year are already pending, then also there is no opportunity for the AO to file an updated return, for the assessee to file an updated return. Lastly, if the AO is already in possession of any information under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act or Black Money Act, then the assessee does not have the opportunity to avail this 2-year window under section 139 subsection 8. Lastly, there is a new section 140 capital B which has been inserted for payment of the enhanced tax pursuant to the updated return which is filed under section 139 subsection 8A. So any enhanced tax which is to be paid under this new provision where an updated return can be filed, the tax for the same has to be deposited under section 140 capital B. So with this, from here I would request my colleague Saurabh to take us further with the further provisions of amendments. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Atul. I think with last point that Atul had mentioned regarding the updated return, the intention of the government is very clear. They want to reduce the litigation, and with this intention, they have come up with a new section 158 capital A capital B, 158 AB, which restricts the income tax authorities to file a appeal before any higher forum where a similar question of law is pending before the ITAT or before the jurisdictional high court. In that case, the question of law has to be similar to the favorable judgment that the taxpayer has received from any of the lower authorities. By doing such restriction, the intention of the revenue or the government is very clear that they want to reduce the litigation. But for the purposes of this provision to be enacted, there is a mechanism that has been proposed to be followed, wherein a collegium consisting of the revenue officers from the authority itself will determine whether the question of law which is pending before the jurisdictional authority or the High Court is similar to the assessee's question in whose favor an order has been passed. Assessee's consent will be required, which in no reasons will should not be a reason to stop. And apart from that, an application needs to be filed to the ITAT or to the High Court before whom such question is pending, that due to such reasons there will be a deferment in filing of the appeal. Only after these mechanisms and steps involved that the appeal can be deferred to. Subsequently, after that, there is a new provision of section 194 IA has been amended to include the stamp duty valuation for the purposes of withholding taxes on purchase of immovable property. The existing provision restricts such withholding to only consideration paid. However, often it has been seen that 43 CA and section 50 C, which comes into picture and play for the purposes of calculation of capital gains, the valuation may differ from what has been paid. Therefore, to bring consistency in the withholding tax provision vis-a-vis the computation of capital gains provision, 194 IA has been amended to state that the withholding shall be done on the higher value of sales consideration or stamp duty valuation, whichever is higher in such case. Moving from the withholding tax provision amendment to immovable property, coming to section 170, which deals with the successor or the predecessor. Now, section 170 as on today states that in case of a predecessor, so in case of a succession by any mode other than the death, the provision comes into play. It states that for the predecessor, the income tax assessment or the liability rests up till the date of succession. For the successor, it starts from the date of succession and onwards. Now, often we have seen that there is a so in case of business reorganizations, which section 170 covers, we have seen that there is a gap between the appointed date and the effective date. That is a date on which the court passes the order. In that gap period, there is generally a issue that who shall be liable for the assessment for that gap period, because generally assessments are taken up after the court has passed the order where the erstwhile entity is not into existence, and therefore any assessment order or any assessment proceedings done for the entity which is not into existence is termed as illegal. Therefore, there was this procedural which needed an amendment, and therefore they have amended this provision to say that where in case there is a business reorganization, the assessments done for that erstwhile entity will be the responsibility of the successor, and accordingly the provisions shall apply to a successor in terms of business reorganization. Coming to section 179, section 179 deals with liability of directors of a private limited company in case of liquidation. Now, this was the heading of this section, which under which the directors of a private company are jointly and severally liable for any of the taxes which are due. Now, the provision at the onset restricted it to only liquidation. The term liquidation has been deleted with. Now the provision reads liability of directors of a private limited company without the word liquidation. For doing so, the provision, now the question is whether this is an expansion of the provision or there was always an intention under this section to include the directors irrespective whether there is a liability because, after liquidation or not. As on today, we can say that the provisions stand expanded. The provisions have been expanded to include any situation other than liquidation also. Further, the term tax, which is the responsibility of the directors of the liquidated company, now of course it includes any company, has been expanded to include the term fees also into it. Therefore, tax includes any fees which shall be payable by such company to the income tax authorities, and section 179 has been amended accordingly. Moving from section 179, coming to the faceless assessment. Now, faceless assessment, when it was proposed to be introduced, there was a lot of ambiguity in terms of the provisions. The provisions have settled over the period of time. Of course, there has been litigation where the whole scheme of faceless assessment has been challenged in terms of the principles of natural justice being demeritated in case of faceless assessment. Now, after that, there has been an amendments in the provision. We have seen notification which are coming into picture to remove such anomalies in the provision. As on today, transfer pricing assessment, dispute resolution panel, proceedings and ITAT have been kept out of faceless. They were supposed to be included from March 2022 onwards and March 2023 onwards respectively. Through this proposal, they have deferred it by another a couple of years or a year as the case may be. The reason that they have given for such deferment is that in case of a transfer pricing assessment under faceless regime and in case of dispute resolution panel proceedings under a faceless regime, there are certain requirements which needs to be brought into the system to make it effective. For the tribunal, the delay has been attributed to the fact that tribunal is considered to be a civil court. Therefore, the inputs are required from the Ministry of Law and Justice, basis which they will devise a scheme to bring it under the faceless regime. Moving from the faceless assessment, coming to the COVID relief. Section 17(2) has been amended to include any amount that is received by the employer towards a COVID treatment shall not be considered as a perquisite. There is no monetary limit that is defined over here. Further, where such amount has been received, it shall not also be treated as an income from other sources. Similar amendments have been done in section 56 to 10. Further, where in case there is any amount that the member of a deceased person receives and such death is attributed to to the COVID illness, there is a exemption up till rupees 10 lakh, that such amount will not be treated as an income of other sources in the hands of the recipient, and such amendments have been proposed in 17(2) and 56(2)(10) respectively. Last amendment, of course, there is one more amendment which I'll cover, and last in terms of the tabulated amendment which we have covered is pertaining to the startups, where these startups which were established up till 31st March 2022 were eligible for the benefits of tax holiday for 3 out of consecutive 10 years from the date of incorporation. Now, due to the pandemic, there has been certain delays, there have been certain lags in terms of the startups being incorporated or registered. Therefore, this timeline has been extended to 31st March 2023. And the time period for tax holiday remains the same, that is 3 out of 10 consecutive assessment years. Moving from these amendments, there has been a insertion which has caught the eye of every person, and every person, those who are dealing or not dealing, are definitely touched by the wave of virtual digital assets. Now, what are exactly these virtual digital assets? Section 2, subsection 47, capital A has been inserted under the provisions of Income Tax Act. This section, which has been inserted, is giving the definition of a virtual digital asset, and it defines the virtual digital asset as an information or a code or a number or a token which is generated through a cryptographic means or otherwise. It also defines it as which is generated through which can be transferred, stored, or traded electronically. Further, there has been a couple of more criteria that have been added to it to qualify as a virtual digital asset. Those criteria are that it should provide a digital representation, or it should be functions as a store of a value or a unit of account. Now, those who are not aware about these cryptocurrencies, this definition definitely may not be able to be easily comprehended, but where someone is aware about the crypto taxes, the concept, this definition is wide enough to cover anything pertaining to the blockchain technology that generates value or that generates revenue, and thus that revenue has now basically been brought into system. The interesting part about this amendment or this about this insertion of the definition is that in 2020, the Supreme Court was faced with an issue wherein the Internet and Mobile Association, IMMA, had filed a case before the Supreme Court against the Reserve Bank of India to strike down the circular which held that cryptocurrencies are illegal currencies and therefore they are not to be dealt with. Now, the Supreme Court, while passing its judgment, affirmed that the virtual currency exchanges are the fundamental rights to trade and to do business, and it is guaranteed under the Constitution of India. After that, there has been no legislation which has been brought in. There is no mechanism basis which we can understand whether these are legal tenders or not. But in spite of these things lacking, they have been included in the Income Tax Act by way of a definition. Now, we may not give these inclusions as an interpretation, but definitely we can draw some persuasive value to say, is the government moving towards the path of recognizing it as a currency which will have its value and which should be brought to tax by including it into the system of reporting. This definition is wide enough to cover even the NFTs, which are non-fungible tokens. Now, what are the tax provisions that have been provided post the definition is the income generated from the sale or transfer of such virtual digital assets is subject to a taxable rate of 30% by introduction of section 115 BBH. The rate is as high as 30%, where the surcharge and cess added brings it to as high as 42%. The cap of surcharge is on such cryptocurrencies has not been capped at any level. Therefore, the highest rate of 37% surcharge shall be applicable. There is a withholding tax that has been proposed by introduction of section 194 capital S at the rate of 1% on the sale or transfer of such virtual digital assets, where any person is receiving such virtual digital assets without any consideration, it shall also be it has also been included as an other income under section 56(2) capital 10. Now, when I read these three insertions or amend to the income tax provision, the fundamental in terms of how these currencies will be valued is something which is right now missing in the finance bill. We expect that the rules will define the valuation, because many a times there can be a situation where cryptocurrencies are exchanged between the users. Where there is an exchange of cryptocurrency, how will that valuation come into picture? Because unless you have monetized the value, there is nothing in terms of the valuation which can be attributed to such cryptocurrencies. In the 1% withholding, what will be the instance of withholding, at what point in time the withholding is required to be done, where there are users of these cryptocurrencies who are outside India and there are buyers who are in India, how the compliance will happen, how will the buyer identify such users, and so on and so forth. These are certain issues which we are expecting certain clarifications on. Further to understand, dwell on the proposals, Indian currency and currency which is be defined under FEMA has been excluded from the definition of virtual digital asset. NFT, as I said, and tokens have been specifically included. I'll just come to the NFT part at the last again. Any expenditure that you will incur on these cryptocurrencies for the purposes of transfer, sale, or purchase will not be allowed as a deduction from the cost, and your gains will be determined basis the deduction only from the cost of acquisition. They will be treated as a separate class of assets. Therefore, no set off or carry forward of losses shall be allowed. This is, I think, something akin to the horse race income. The valuation criteria, as I mentioned, is a miss. Now, NFT and token, I'll just visit that thing once again. Now, many a times there can be a situation where the land value is monetized through the digital means. That is through the tokens, property tokens, if I may have to mention it as. Now, where the land, if I sell it otherwise, is taxable as a long-term or a short-term capital gain at the rate of 30%, 15%, 20%, 10%, as the case may be, there is a distinction that has been created that moment such land is monetized through a digital technology, such monetization has been brought to tax at a higher rate of 30%. The reasons have not been given. The government has kept the power to has given the power to the income tax authorities to include or exclude certain more assets. But as on today, the definition is wide enough to cover every bit of a virtual currency or virtual transaction in terms of the Bitcoin technology or the blockchain technology into its ambit. So I think basis that I am bringing a close to the direct tax proposals that has been brought by the budget 2022. from this, I will hand over the session to Ankur, who will take you through the customs provisions, the indirect tax provision, including customs provisions. Over to you, Ankur. Thank you.
Thanks, Saurabh. Good evening, everyone. If I talk about indirect tax, so under GST, we saw a few positive changes like extending the final date for availment of credit from September to November, or mechanism to allow transfer of balance between electronic cash ledger of different states. But it also witnessed additional restrictions on availment of credit, such as payment of tax by the vendor, legitimacy of the vendor's entire credit pool. So it's a mixed bag for GST. If we come to customs, the entire focus was to strengthen the Make in India concept, and hence concessions on project import and capital goods are decided to be phased out. Further, the rationalization of customs duty exemptions and tariff rate and withdrawal of redundant notifications have been done away to further simplify the tariff structure. Further, under SEZ, the law was said to be replaced by a new legislation. So it feels that the bottlenecks that were there with the existing SEZ law with respect to if somebody has a domestic supply and with the current system of work from home, we believe those situations should be covered up, and with the new legislation, it should be made more competitive in terms of the overall scheme of things. Now, if we move on to the GST amendments, so the first amendment that we see is with respect to the Section 16 amendment. So Section 16 provides for conditions for availment of ITC. Now, this section has been amended to provide that the list of ineligible ITC, as mentioned in GSTR 2B, would not be allowed as ITC from notified date. However, such ineligibility is linked to with the supplier's default, which is practically out of the recipient control. So the restriction under Section 38, which I'll cover in subsequent slide, definitely talks about more on the defaults of the supplier, basis which the credit can be inhibited or can be made ineligible for the recipient. I like to highlight one legal maxim which says lex non coget ad impossibilia, which simply means that a law cannot compel a man to do what he cannot possibly do. Therefore, the provision that have been brought or the restriction that have been brought in the act with respect to restriction of credit, we'll have to test the legal validity of these provisions, and because there have been judicial rulings holding that ITC should not merely be denied because of the default of the supplier, provided the recipient has taken sufficient actions to understand or to ensure that the various provisions, the provision with respect to availment of credit has been, whatever is in control of him, has been taken undertaken by the recipient. Now, if I talk about the next amendment, which is the amendment in Section 37, this section provides the guidelines for filing GSTR 1. As few provisions were relating to GSTR 2 and 3, therefore those have been omitted because the government continues to be following the same practice of GSTR 1 and GSTR 3. Therefore, all the provisions pertaining to GSTR 2 and 3 have been omitted. The changes have been have been made in to make in line with the existing law. A new subsection has also been inserted, which provides that GSTR 1 cannot be filed without filing the GSTR 1 of the previous ones. This restriction was already implemented by the GST portal before any legal backing. So this amendment is primarily to give a ratification for legal backing to the amendment that has already been enforced in the GST portal. So, and then there are enabling provisions wherein the government can issue notification for relaxation of such provisions for specified class of persons. Moving on to the next slide. The time limit for ITC amendment under section 16, issuance of credit note under section 34, and TCS written under 52, plus any rectifying details under section for GSTR 1 and 3B has been extended from existing September to November 30 of subsequent year. This comes as a welcome move, as the books of account of many companies are not finalized till September 30. So there was a lot of loss of credit, or there was a lots of amendment opportunity that if the books are being closed beyond September 30, the entities were not able to claim those benefits in the returns. So with the due date extending to 30th November, we believe that those loss of opportunities and credits availment would come down much lower. So moving on to next slide. This, which I was referring to, section 38. So section 38 primarily provides guidelines for communication of details of inward supplies. Now, this has been substituted in entirety to prescribe the manner, conditions, and restrictions for communication of details of inward supplies and ITC to the recipient by means of an auto-generated statement, which is GSTR 2B, and to do away with that two-way communication process in the written filing. Now, there are certain restrictions that have been imposed, namely the newly registered persons for a period as may be specified, persistent default in payment of tax by a vendor, liability disclosed in GSTR 1 exceeds the GSTR 3B, credit availed in excess of the prescribed limit, credit beyond the maximum proportion of output liability, which may be discharged through ECL, any other prescribed class of person. With these, so if we consider these amendment, it definitely seems the government is very adamant on punishing the recipient by restricting the ITC due to non-compliance of the supplier. Therefore, no actual fault of the recipient, but the non-compliances by the supplier is also being hampered or being subject to the recipient fault. And also, there was a Kolkata High Court judgment in case of LGW Industry, which actually held that the benefit of ITC cannot be denied if the assessee has documents to support their claim or genuineness of the transaction, even when there was no failure in complying with any of the obligations under the GST Act. Now, with this amendment, the intent is to negate that ruling, and now since these restrictions are forming part of the Act, so the ruling would be nullified. If we talk about the current facility, that now even if we say that this system has been implemented, so if we talk about the current facility, so there's no actual facility to verify whether a supplier is making timely and correct payments, and the GSTR 2B is only way where I can see that supplier has reported, as a recipient I can see the supplier has reported the supply that they have made to me. In the absence of any mechanism to verify that tax payments made by the supplier or compliances done by the supplier, introduction of such provisions seems to be very draconian. This would definitely, we feel that would hamper the business of many small and medium taxpayers. Moving on to the next slide. As the existing, as I said, the two-way communication and system and the current system of GSTR 1 and 3B would be continued. Therefore, provisions relating to alternate system of returns, that is section 42, 43, and 43A, are being omitted. Next one is that late fee has been now prescribed for the TCS return. The last one is pertaining to introduction of facility of transfer of balance available in electronic cash ledger to the distinct person, that is different registrations under same PAN. So a lot of effort or a lot of request was made by the industry to also extend this benefit to the electronic credit ledger, but that has not happened, and it's only with respect to the cash portion that the government has, with this amendment, has allowed transfer of that cash to different states, but not the credit amount. Now moving on to the changes under the customs law. Sorry, next slide. Yeah. So before moving on to the provisions or the amendments brought in, the major changes that have happened. So first, I'd like to give you a background. The powers to perform various functions under the customs are assigned by virtue of notification number 40/2012, which was issued by the TBEC in exercise of power which was non-existing under section 234. There was a decision, Supreme Court decision last year with respect to Canon India, in which this Apex Code highlighted this ambiguity and held that the cases that have been initiated by Additional Director General of DRI by issuing show cause notices are invalid and are without any authority of law, since the notification is in itself valid, having been issued by an authority which had no power to do so. As a consequence, it is manifest that only the customs officer who have been assigned the specific function of assessment and reassessment of duty in the jurisdictional area where the import concern has been affected by either the Board of Commissioner in terms of section 234 is competent to issue notice under section 28 of the Act. Now, in order to overcome this infirmity in the law, various legislative changes have been brought under. So the first one that we see, the meaning of term proper officer is modified to cover the officers who has been assigned those functions by the board or the principal commissioner of customs under section 5 of the Customs Act. Further, in order to remove any ambiguity with respect to the class of officers of the custom, section 3 is also amended to include officers of DRI, audit and preventive formation as the class of officers of customs. Sorry, next slide. Further, since mere drawing of power from the definition clause is not sufficient, therefore a specific power is not inserted in the main section by inserting section 1A and 1B to section 5 of the Customs Act 1962. So this means that the board and the principal commissioner can assign such functions to any officer, to any class of officer, and those class of officer would be deemed to be the proper officer of customs with respect to that particular activity. Moving on to the next section 14, section 14. So section 14 primarily deals with the valuation of goods. So there has been amendment which proposes to include rules enabling the board to specify the additional obligations to an importer whose value the board feel which has been declared as not correct, the criteria of selection of such goods, and the checks in respect of such goods. Now, to give you perspective, generally the transaction value of the goods imported is accepted under customs, where the buyer and seller are not related and price charged is the sole consideration. In case of related party transaction, definitely there is a separate provision of special valuation branch in which the authorities do check whether the prices are at arm's length or not. But in case of non-related party, generally their transaction value is the acceptable valuation. However, in order to curb the menace of undervaluation, these amendment has now been inserted in respect of certain class of goods where the board has reason to believe that the value of such goods may not be declared truthfully or accurately, having regard to the trend of declared value of such goods or any other relevant criteria. Then in such case, the authorities can impose certain additional obligation on the importer, which would be required to be fulfilled by them. Now, with this amendment, it definitely seems that the compliance burden on the importer is going to increase with additional declarations, verifications, and checks, even though the rules are yet to be notified. But this is with these checks, definitely it would increase the compliance burden. Now, moving on to the next slide, certain amendments have been proposed in respect to advanced ruling provisions. Now, so presently, while making an application for advanced ruling, there is an application fee that is to be paid of INR 10,000. Now, by virtue of the proposed amendment, the details of application fee of 10,000 rupee has been removed, and the power is now provided to the board to prescribe the fee by way of rules. The actual details of the application fee would be known definitely once the rules are notified. But and secondly, with respect to so there is a time limit to withdraw. So if you have filed an advanced ruling application, you, as per the erstwhile provision, you could withdraw that application within 30 days of filing that application. Now, the amendment has been made in the provisions which provides a flexibility to the applicant to withdraw his application at any time before the ruling is pronounced. Further, now before the amendment, the advanced ruling was binding on the assessee for a lifetime until and unless there was a change in law or change in the facts of the case. However, now the advanced ruling shall remain valid only for a period of 3 years or till there is a change in law or facts on the basis of which advanced ruling has been pronounced. Therefore, it seems now the proposed amendment seems to be giving room for the authorities for adopting the interpretation in favor of the revenue developed during the course of time, even when there is no change in the law to such effect after 3 years of passing the advanced ruling. So even if I've got the advanced ruling, now after 3 years, the authorities might take a different stand, and hence the entire business model will need to rework. So moving on to the next slide with respect to IGCR. Now the IGCR rules have been amended to allow electronic submission of data, providing end-to-end automation and through the customs portal. The importers would require to generate a import of goods at IGCR IN number or IN number from common portal. Simplification by standardizing the various forms and doing away the need of transaction-based permission intimations. Instead of quarterly returns, now the returns would be on a monthly basis. So these are basically the changes or amendments to further ease of the compliances and the requirements under IGCR, making it more automated and reducing the overall liaising with the officers. So moving on to the next. Moving on to the tariff changes. So BCD, if I talk about the tariff changes, so BCD rates on a number of goods in sectors like chemicals, textile are proposed to be changed from 1st May on the basis of exercise carried out to simplify tariff structure. Simplification of such customs tariff structure by moving unconditional concessional rates from existing exemption notification to the customs tariff schedule. Amendments proposed to align with the Indian tariff with the complementary amendments to the HSN 2022 published by WCO as signatory to HS Convention. These complementary amendments include minor changes across chapters in the tariff, aimed to bring greater clarity to the entire tariff structure. Stipulation of sunset date for conditional exemptions entry in respect of exemption notifications, which might include the equipments, instruments, raw material, components, pilot plants, with respect to computer software used in R&D project, goods relating to defense, internal security, capital goods used by the IT electronic industry. So these are few examples on which sunset clause has been, exemption notification has been introduced. About 17 notifications which can cover around 350 exemptions in total have been rescinded. Some of these were actually obsolete or redundant, and for some the validity was already expired, so those have been rescinded. The exemption, the major notification of 50/2017. So pruning and review of that exemption notification has happened. The exemptions on lot of items have been withdrawn and added to the tariff structure itself, and few exemptions have been withdrawn with respect to textile sector, power sector, petroleum sector, and few others. So moving on to the next. Now, during last year, there were lot of investigations conducted by DRI, Customs Officer, following the Supreme Court ruling in the case of Unicorn Industry, that if custom duty has been exempted by a notification, for example, EPCG or advance authorization, social welfare surcharge was still payable. Demand notices were raised, and the importers were being asked to pay the SWS basis the notional custom duty. Now, in order to rest the dispute, the government has issued a clarificatory circular highlighting that no SWS is payable if the custom duty on that imported product is nil. Therefore, the entire investigation and demand have been put to rest, giving a major relief to all the importers. Moving on to the next. So here we have highlighted certain key products where there has been change in duty rate. So camera lens, which is used for cellular mobile phone, it has shifted from 15 or 10% to 2.5%. So these are primarily to promote domestic manufacturing. So inputs are being reduced wherever required, and in with respect to project import or capital goods, so those exemptions are being withdrawn or phased out. So if we see the air purifier or diamonds, these have while come down, whereas the hearable devices, smart meters, solar cells, solar modules, part of electronic tie, these have actually got up and would be effective from 1st of April 22. As I said, apart from these modification that have been done in the tariff structure, the project imports and the capital goods which enjoy a concessional duty structure as of now. So the idea is to phase these out gradually, and so currently whatever the rate is with effect from 30th September 22, these projects would be chargeable at the rate 7.5%. So whatever projects that are ongoing and are enjoying lower rate of duty would continue till the 30th September 23. After that, each and every project, but however, any project registered after 30th September 22 would be subject to only 7.5%. And the idea is that with effect from 30th September 23, all the project, irrespective new or old, the exemptions would be, the concession rate would be withdrawn, and the rates would be flat as 7.5% for all the projects. With this, I conclude the indirect tax part, and I invite Mr. Atul, if you can provide the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Ankur, and thanks, Saurabh, for supporting and giving your insights on this Finance Budget 2022. In order to conclude the overall impact of the budget, at SW India, we have gone through in depth with the provisions which basically not only with respect to the collection of the taxes but also with respect to the expenditure which the government is incurring. So how in a summarized way, what we could analyze and what we could conclude is that this budget is for enhancing the public investment and asset creation, creation of public infrastructure, which would actually lead to crowding of private investment. This is very much visible with respect to the capital expenditure, which has been increased from 5.5 lakh crore to 7.5 lakh crore within a period of 1 year, which clearly shows the focus of the government on infrastructure boost. So I would say this is the opportunity for India to come forward and explore the plethora of business potential considering the initiatives which are being taken by the government of India. So with this, I conclude the session from our side. Over to you, Sumati. Thank you.
Just one thing, I think we have received many questions before the start of the session. So those questions we have received from IGCC, and we will be answering those questions in person after this webinar in a couple of days' time. So can we conclude the session?
Hello, hi. Thank you to all our speakers for the insight. Now moving on to our question and answer session. So one of our participants would like to know about new provision section 179 of income tax, director's liability of private limited company, and TDS provisions under section 194R and 194S. Over to you, speakers.
I think on section 179, I'll just take it up. So 179, as we had detailed at that point in time, I'll just go to that specific slide just to answer it. What exactly is the change? In the meanwhile, while I search for the slide, 179, the amendment has been the preamble of the section starts with liability of the directors in case of liquidation. Now they have done away with the term liquidation and they have just simply said liability of the directors. This amendment, to our understanding, has broadened the scope of the existing provisions which till now were restricted to the liability of directors only in case of liquidation. That means where there is a business reorganization, where there is an insolvency or so on and so forth, and such other situations, even those situations will now be covered under the provisions and the term tax, which was considered to be the liability that the directors have to meet, where in case there has been a gross negligence or misconduct. That word tax has been though tax was defined in an inclusive manner, the definition has been amended to include fees also in that term. Therefore, the scope of the liability increases in terms of the amount that can be claimed from the director, that is tax inclusive of fees also now. This is what the amendment of 179 is, and we have covered it. If there's anything as a follow-up question to what I have just mentioned, I'll be happy to answer it subsequently.
On the withholding provisions, there was another question with respect to section 194R. I would make it further more clear that this withholding section has been included with respect to the income which is recognized under the provisions of section 28 subsection 4, where any arrangement or any incentive which is given in kind under a business arrangement, that will be taxable. So as I mentioned, that these kind of arrangements which were incentives which were given in kind used to escape the tax net. So in order to cover them or bring them into the ambit of taxation, these the onus has been put specifically on the payer. So the moment the income gets accrued in kind or in cash it definitely gets captured in the records, but when it goes in kind it doesn't get captured. So if there is any income which goes in kind, any perquisite or incentive, in that, like to give an example, like any kind of vacation or any kind of vouchers which are given to the employees pursuant to the employer-employee relationship, or any kind of dealer incentives which are given to the dealers due to achieving a certain target, like any kind of travel or any such voucher or credits which are not basically recognized as part of the business transaction, then it escapes the tax net. So in order to cover that, the provisions of section 194 has been inserted, on which if the value of the perquisite exceeds 20,000 rupees in a particular financial year, then that entire transaction will be subject to 10% of withholding tax under section 194R.
So I think this is more relevant from the recipient's perspective, because the payer or the giver was always claiming it as a business expense.
Yes.
Thank you. Our next question is in reference to section 38. How can one know that supplier is newly registered?
So I think this is pertaining to GST.
Yeah.
Right. So in the GST Common Portal, there is a facility wherein you can go and search your dealer, your vendor or your customer, wherein you'll have a look at it from where it is registered, what is the compliance status. You can get all those details in the GST Compliance Portal. You can go there, search through the GST number of that your vendor or supplier. You'll get those details.
Yeah. Next question.
Okay. So that's all for now. Thank you so much, speaker, for answering the questions. We will send the remaining question to our speakers and they will get back to you over email. And now I would like to hand over to Ms. Sumati Sood for closing remarks.
Right. So thank you very much, Atul, Saurabh, and Ankur for that detailed explanation. I think the audience was there to the right till the end, and thank you very much for all the people who have attended this session. We will be sending the recording as well as the presentation with all these slides with all the participants, the ones who registered and who participated after the session. And yeah, thank you for tuning in today, and goodbye from the Indo-German Chamber of Commerce. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
IGCC for your support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.